Hello, Jason here from Emerald Computers, and I want to give you a quick little guide on buying a computer. Today's topic is going to be selecting a processor. There's a lot of confusion out in the market, and rightly so, because a lot of what's going on has been a little bit weird. The biggest confusion comes in the names of processors. That's what we're going to talk about today. Of course, when you have Intel, you have i3, i5, i7. Those are the big historical ones. Obviously, below that, you would have Pentium, and even below that, you would have Celeron. One step below that, you would have Atom. And then recently, at the very high end, they've also come out with Atom processor, with i9 processors, which are one step better than even the i7. But that's not the end-all, be-all of it. It's more important to think about generations. We are currently on generation 14, which according to Intel will be the last generation. They're going to be renaming the processors going forward into just Core 5, Core 7, Core 9, Core 3. They're dropping the I, so there won't be any more I series, and it's going to get a lot more confusing going forward. In fact, this new naming system is incredibly crazy, and I don't even think Intel has figured it out. Not that their stock is doing any good right now. Could be a reflection of that. Let me let you know that what's more important than what I series it is what generation it is. The first generation came out almost 15 years ago. And then they had second gen, third gen, and then fourth gen came out. And fourth gen was out for a couple of years. Fourth gen was the big one that Windows 8 was launched pretty much right around the fourth gen time. And they had all these different processors, i5, i3, i7. They even made a higher end version called the 4790, and that was pretty cool. They also have letters just to make it even more confusing. If you see the letter K at the end of it, that means it's a more powerful one that you can actually overclock and make significantly better. If you don't see anything after it, then that's fine. If you see something like an M, like on a mobile processor, or a U, M means it's designed for mobile. U means ultra low powered, which means ultra low performance also, just to let you know. Then you also have T, which is kind of like between the regular one and the regular one and the letter U. It's less performance, less power, but it's not really designed for laptops like the U is. It's designed for more like super small form factor computers. Those are what the letters mean. But back to the generations. Fourth gen was a big gen. Fifth gen came out. They made just a handful of chips for computers and quickly launched sixth gen. So fifth gen was out. You're almost impossible to find a desktop computer with a fifth gen processor. There are quite a few laptops. Fifth gen was mostly a laptop generation. Then you came sixth gen, seventh gen. Seventh gen was out for a couple of years and made some really, really nice ones. The seventh gen i7 7700K was a very famous processor that a lot of people did. Now, what you got to realize is generations are almost as much better than the prior, well, usually, not always, but like say, for example, the seventh generation i5 is going to be significantly more powerful than the fourth gen i7. Every time you go up a generation, everything else kind of slides down. Then we finally came out with 8th gen. And 8th gen implemented a whole bunch of security procedures, extra processes, and that's why these extra instructions and these extra security procedures are implemented in such a way, and that's why everybody who runs Windows 11, the people, Microsoft really wants you to use an 8th gen or newer processor on Windows 11. And if you have a 7th gen processor, which honestly could run Windows 11 perfectly, they're like, no, you can't run it. And you can get around it. There's a little batch file you can run, and it lets you get Windows 11 on any computer, even if the generation's too old. But 8th gen has been out now for quite a while. Still many, many years. I don't know I can't remember exactly when it came out. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. It's been out for quite a while. And really, if you're getting a new computer now or a used computer, you probably want to look at the generations. Here's a couple laptops I have. This one here says i7, and you're going to see this 8 right here, 8650U. 8 means 8th gen. 6050U, that's kind of like the tier level within the i7, and U means it's an ultra low powered computer. This one right here, same deal. This is going to be a 10th gen, also a U processor right there. You can just kind of go around and look at processors. Here's an 11th gen. These are obviously used computers. As I said, we're up to 14th now. 11th gen is from about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5. And they try to come up with a new generation every year around Christmas time lately because, it gets people to upgrade and buy new computers. Though the differences are not huge from generation to generation. Once 8th generation came, a lot of the focus started being upon saving electricity, adding additional features, adding things that are called efficiency cores versus power cores. Instead of having, like say a typical i3 might be a quad core processor, well, now they can make it with just 2 power cores and 4 efficiency cores. So now it's technically a 6-core processor, but it might actually be a little bit worse than the quad core processor that was all power cores. These efficiency cores are significantly smaller, less powerful cores, but you can put basic tasks on them so that your main processor is more for the newer cores. So when it comes to Intel, you have the i3 is now modern day ones are usually quad core. Back in the day, most i3s were dual core. You got i5 is usually also quad core. Sometimes recently it's mostly 6 cores. It can have models with hyperthreading or models without hyperthreading. And then i7 can be 6 cores, 8 cores, 12 cores. Sometimes they had hyperthreading, sometimes they don't. And then the 9th gen can even have 16 cores with hyperthreading, giving you 32 threads, and you're paying more. And there's so many different numbers that even somebody like me now, we're looking it up every single time. We have to look at, this particular model with these particular features, let's see what it has, because in each generation now, Intel's releasing 50 to 70 different processors with different SKUs. And if you do that multiplied times 14 generations, you're talking almost 1,000 different processors that Intel has released since the i-series came around. And that's impossible to memorize, impossible to benchmark. Now, a lot of those processors are very rare and you're never really going to see them. There's a few big popular ones in each generation, the 7700K or the 12700, various ones like that. Now, to make it even more complicated, Intel's not the only game in town. You also have AMD, which makes Ryzen processors. And now if you look at their numbering system is even worse. They started with Ryzen, and then they have a 3, 5, and 7. They also have a Ryzen 9 once the 3000 series came out. And their first series was called Ryzen 3 1000, 1000 something, then 2000 something, then 3000 something. And then they skipped 4,000. 4,000 was just for laptops. So then they made 5,000 something. And then 6,000 was, again, just for laptops. And the new ones are 7,000. If you were to go and get the top of the line Ryzen 7 7000 series, which is, I think, a 7800X3D, that right now beats every single Intel i-series processor. There isn't an i-series processor that can beat that AMD chip. And if you're comparing, so we do have some Ryzens. Like here is a Ryzen, this is an old one, Ryzen 5 2500. This one is going to be a little bit better than an 8th gen. So it's a little bit better than this one, even though it's priced at a lower price because Ryzen processors are less expensive. Also, Ryzen processors for the same performance typically get a little bit less electrical usage. I'm saying typically because that's how it was for a little while. Some particular processors from Intel actually do better than the Ryzens. So it's another thing you got to look up and you got to compare. There's very little general rules of thumb right now. Though I will tell you right now, if you were to get the i7 7700K, one of the best processors out there for the seventh generation, and that's an i7. And then you compare that to the i5 10th gen. Well, the i5 10th gen is better. And then let's compare that again to the i3 from like the 14th gen. Well, now the i3 from the 14th gen is better than both of those. One of my biggest pet peeves is people come to our store. I had one today, and they're like, I need an i7 processor. And I'm like, what generation do you want? And they're like, we don't know what generations are. I have no idea. And I'm like, well, let me see their specs. And they have some specs from 12 years ago that says they need an i7 6th gen processor. And I'm like, well, you want to run Windows 11, right? And you want better performance. Well, why don't we get you a 10th gen i5? It's going to run really, really well. If you really want an i7, we can do it. But 10th gen i5 is twice as fast as the 6th gen i7 that they're talking about. When you're buying a processor, the generation is way more important than the i5, i7, i9 variant like that. I personally run the Ryzen 9 3900X. It's a phenomenal processor. It's more speed than I need, and I'm a freaking computer expert at this. It's enough. I mean, it has a lot of cores. It's 32 core. It's 16 cores hyper-threaded to 32. It's insanely powerful, and for what I do, I don't need anything more. You do video editing. I play a little bit of video games. Even the new 14th gen i5 isn't that much better than my Ryzen 9. There's really not too much of a reason to upgrade, so I don't. And you don't need to upgrade all the time as if you buy a decently good processor. So that's another one. You don't want to go future-proof yourself to where you're spending so much money that it's going to hurt you in the long run, but you do want to buy something a little bit faster than you probably would really, really need. You want to have somebody like us spend the time to do the education with you. You don't want to just go hunt an i7 because somebody said, I need an i7. You need to really think about what generation you want. As I said before, I'd really try to stick. If you think you're ever going to use Windows 11, I would really try to stick with a 8th gen or newer, and I would only go to 8th or 9th gen. 9th gen was a very quickly skipped over generation also. I would only really go to 8th gen or 9th gen if you want something a little bit lower end and it's like, it's a little computer that's going to watch YouTube and you work on Office. That's all you really need. If you're doing anything a little bit more powerful, stick with 10th gen, maybe a little bit better. 8th gen was the first generation. Well, there's a little bit of overlap. It was the first generation that DDR4 became mainstream. Though you can find motherboards and chipsets that will, in the 8th gen, that will still work with DDR3. They're pretty few and far between. The 10th gen, which is also pretty much all the Ryzens, for the most part, use DDR4 also. I have seen just a handful of Ryzen 1000 series that could use DDR3. Just don't buy those. DDR4 is significantly better. And when the 13th gen Intel and the 7000 series AMD Ryzen processors came out, they jumped up to DDR5. DDR5, the main benefit of DDR5 is that it uses way less power. So it's more power efficient, gonna make less heat. It's only slightly faster, and there are some issues with it and a little bit of compatibility issues. Some of the RAM that you use in Intel won't work very well on a high-end AMD system, and vice versa. You want to make sure you got the right RAM. There's a lot of little things and little nuances you want to check. We're almost at 15 minutes here, so I'm going to wrap this video up. But the general lessons are, look into AMD, look into getting a higher generation versus a higher numbered processor. Make sure if you go to the next level where you can get the better RAM, definitely do that. On a completely different subject, make sure whatever computer you're getting, even if it's refurbished, even if it's 10 years old, make sure it has an SSD. We don't sell anything in our store that doesn't have an SSD, and I don't think anybody should buy a computer that doesn't have an SSD anymore. That's a completely different topic. If you need some expert help, you can give us a call, 623-240-2424. Right there's the phone number. Or come into one of our 2 stores. We can give you a lot of advice. We can help you out. If you buy a computer from us, that's great. If you just wanted some advice and you buy it somewhere else, that's fine too. We're always here to help. Our goal is to make technology easy for you, and hopefully this video was a good introductory lesson in that. Have an awesome day, everybody.